Okay, I would like to welcome everyone to the Bar Council's annual disability event, Neurodiversity at the Bar. Um, First, a couple of points on housekeeping and reasonable adjustments for this event. Closed captions can be enabled on the Zoom webinar by clicking the CC Captions button on the bottom of the screen. The session is being recorded and the recording will be made available afterwards on the Bar Council website. And we have received a number of questions before the event. If you have other questions, please post them in the Q&A box, but not in the chat, and we will deal with as many questions as we can later on. A couple of words in introduction from me. The Bar Council's Pupil Survey 2024 found that 1 in 5 pupils identified as disabled. It also found a number of stark disparities between the experiences of disabled and non-disabled pupils, including that disabled pupils were more than 7 times more likely to report a negative experience, and what it described as a vast difference between disabled and non-disabled pupils in terms of their perception of the viability of a career at the bar. The stats don't yet differentiate pupils with different disabilities or those that identify as neurodivergent. However, neurodivergent pupils report that chambers and supervisors often do not understand how to deal appropriately with reasonable adjustments for them. As one respondent to the Bar Council survey said, there was a complete lack of reasonable adjustments or discussion around hidden disabilities or neurodiversity, particularly compared to visible or physical disabilities. So this event is part of the Bar Council's work to understand and tackle the challenges that disabled and neurodivergent practitioners, particularly pupils, face at the bar. Our work, including our most recent event at the Pupillage Fair, highlights the huge concerns that neurodivergent pupils and others with non-apparent disabilities have about whether and how much to disclose in pupillage in order to get the RAs they need, as a result of conscious and unconscious bias and risk of consequent disadvantage and discrimination. When doing work on reasonable adjustments in any context at the bar, there are 2 problems in particular. Firstly, reasonable adjustments need to take account of some unusual, even unique aspects of the bar as a profession and pupillage as a training for it. That's true and shows the need to hear from disabled and neurodivergent barristers themselves in designing and dealing with reasonable adjustments. Secondly, the view that the bar is exceptional, that only barristers understand what it takes to do this job, and therefore only they can judge whether adjustments are consistent with doing the job. That's not really true. In fact, lots of reasonable adjustments that will benefit practitioners and pupils are similar to those in other workplaces, and barristers are far from unique in considering themselves exceptional. This mindset is used wrongly to say that evolving workplace best practice has no or only limited relevance to the bar. In fact, we have a lot to learn from it. So we're going to hear from within and outside the bar. The first half of the event is going to consist of a presentation by Helen Eaton, who will then join an expert panel with Alice de Coverley and Oliver May, who will spend the second half of the meeting answering your questions posed before and during this event. A word on our speakers. Helen is a neurodiversity specialist with 20 years experience of designing and delivering leadership and communication skills training. She has applied neurodiversity training across a huge range of public and private sector organizations. Her work celebrates the strengths of neurodiversity and the power and creativity of neurodivergent minds and she combines an understanding of neurodiverse teams and organizations with lived experience and relevant real-life stories. Alice is a barrister practicing in education, equality, and public law at Three Paper Buildings, and a trustee of neurodiversity and law. Alice recently won the Legal 500 ESG Award for Disability Neurodiversity Bar Champion of the Year. As a barrister with ADHD, she is passionate about advancing the representation of all neurodivergent lawyers so that no mind is left behind at the bar, the bench, and beyond. Oliver is a barrister at Number 5 Chambers, specialising in clinical negligence, personal injury, and inquests. Oliver was a founding member and former chair of Neurodiversity in Law, a member of the BSB Race Equality Task Force, and the Bar Council's Disability Panel. I'm Mark Henderson. I am chairing this event. As I said, I'm a barrister at Doughty Street Chambers, and I'm the chair of the Disability Panel. So without further ado, I'm going to turn over to Helen for what I am sure is going to be an incredibly valuable presentation. Helen.
Thank you for that introduction. I always feel as though I need to take somebody along with me to do these introductions because they do them far better than I do sometimes. So thank you, Mark. It is really lovely to be invited to talk this evening. This is a very important topic to me. The base reason of that is I live in a neurodivergent household with people out in the workplace. There are 5 of us, all neurodivergent, out there working. And I see day-to-day people succeeding and thriving as neurodivergent people, self-employed, employed, all sorts of organisations. But I also see people really, really struggling. And I see the challenges my own family face and many other people face. So it's fantastic to be able to talk to this about this subject. I'm not assuming any level of knowledge. So you may be familiar with some of the things I'm talking about. It may be completely new. I'm hoping to bust some of those myths and take some of the fear and anxiety away from the subject of neurodiversity. Many people think they know what it means. Many people think they might be able to describe autism or ADHD or dyslexia. But it's, you know, it's questioning where you're getting that information from, because if it's mainstream media, it's not the most reliable source, and certainly not TV shows that are representing neurodivergent people. And if you've met one neurodivergent person, you have just met one. We come in many varieties and forms. So as I take us through this session, I'm just going to hopefully build some ideas, but give you some ideas around what neurodiversity means, but give you some practical tools as well. In terms of supporting the people around you, supporting people through pupillage, but some of these things might apply to you as well. So increasing knowledge of who you are if you perhaps are neurodivergent. Social media and I fall out quite a lot, but if you do want to find me, these are ways to find me. I don't have a good relationship with social media, but I do try, so I am contactable. Should you want to clarify anything that I've said this evening, or something that doesn't quite make sense, or you'd like more information on. Let's start with thinking about neurodiversity then. It is a concept and it's a movement. It's not a medical diagnosis. Nobody will ever be diagnosed as being neurodivergent. You will hear that term bandied around. You will hear people own it, disown it, argue with the language. It's a concept, and it kind of began in the 80s and the 90s. Now I'm going to pause a second because my slides have disappeared. There we go, they're back. Phew. It's neurodiversity is the recognition of diversity in neurological development. It's recognizing that some minds have developed from birth, from the right at the start, along a different developmental pathway. For example, an autistic mind or an ADHD mind. I'll pull those terms apart. And there are people who are neurotypical. I'm not going to use the word normal, because how can we define the word normal? But there are 6 distinct conditions that lead rise to sort of neurodivergent conditions. And then everybody else, the rest of us, the majority, neurotypical minds. Neurodivergent people have one or more of 6 different conditions which impact how a person processes and experiences the world around them. If we think about what our brain controls, what our brain is in charge of, if there are neurodevelopmental differences within the brain, that's going to impact us in lots of different ways. So that's the word neurodiversity. Some people don't associate themselves with that term. So we might say, oh, you're neurodivergent. Can I make any adjustments for you because you're neurodivergent? But it is just a concept and an idea. It's not given out as a medical diagnosis. It's a concept and a movement that more and more people are interested in, again, excited about getting interested in. It's not a formal medical diagnosis. It's just a grouping together of these terms because there's commonality between them, there's overlap between them, and they sit really nicely together in terms of how a person is kind of processing and functioning. So perhaps that sort of explains the term neurodiversity a little bit for you in terms of where that concept and that idea comes from. And the 6 conditions that we group together under the headline statement of neurodiversity. I had a feeling that I might have a slight technical glitch today. It's very unusual, but today it is happening for me. Let's have a look. All right, we're back. So, sorry, the 6 diagnoses, autism, ADHD, dyslexia, dysgraphia, dyspraxia, dyscalculia. Give yourself a score out of 6. How many of those have you heard of? How many of those could you adequately describe? Probably about 8 years ago, I might have spoken about autism, ADHD. I might have known one dyslexic person, but I will pull these terms apart for you today. So these are the 6 conditions that we put together under the headline statement of neurodiversity or neurodivergent individual. Defining autism really loosely, we think about it in terms of some social communication processing differences. We think about autism in terms of a person who might have some quite fixed thoughts, might show some inflexibility of thoughts under certain circumstances, but is generally very good at knowing something in detail, very good at focusing, very good at really having in-depth knowledge of a particular subject. So that's kind of autism. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. Sometimes people imagine it, as I did years ago, you'd see TV programs, that naughty boy in the classroom, never staying in class, running away, you know, graffitiing, doing all sorts of horrendous things. That's what we thought ADHD was. We now understand it far better. People sometimes describe it as the Tigger in the room. Think of Tigger in Winnie the Pooh. That energy, that enthusiasm, that bounce that can be mental energy or physical energy, but then the lows and the lack of attention, the lack of focus sometimes. So ADHD can be like the Tigger in the room. I will provide better explanations for these, but it's just that outline idea as we go through the session. Dyslexia. If you're dyslexic, you will have difficulties processing language around sounds, spelling, the reading, the writing of language, and whatever language that is. Dyslexia appears in every kind of country around the world and every language. Dysgraphia, the headline statement around that, a little clue in the title. Dysgraphia affects a person in how they might write or put pen to paper. So dysgraphia is when you can visualize a word, you know a word, but you can't get your hand, you can't get those motor skills to write it down. Dyspraxia is a movement coordination difficulty to varying degrees. So if a person has dyspraxia, they may get more tired, be a little bit clumsier, be a little bit awkward in their movement. And that's because the brain isn't quite sending the signals to the bits of the body to maintain consistent movement throughout the day. And dyscalculia, the clue is in the title. It is the numbers version of dyslexia. A person with dyscalculia will have difficulty processing numbers, some mathematical concepts, might make mistakes around numbers fairly commonly. And these 6 conditions are grouped together under the banner of being neurodivergent. And neurodivergent minds alongside neurotypical minds create a neurodiverse environment. So these are just the headline statements. I'll go into a little bit more detail. In terms of what makes us neurodivergent as a person, we all have layers. So it's important when you're thinking of employing or working with an autistic pupil or an ADHD pupil or a dyslexic pupil, we all have layers of our personality, our lives, our values, our principles, our education, our ethics, our faith, everything that has made us us. We all have these layers and they're different for everyone. And that's what makes us brilliant and excellent at what we do. If we're neurodivergent, there are processing differences within the brain that affect a part of the brain, but filter out into so many other areas. So if we're neurodivergent, there are distinct processing differences that mean we are functioning and processing around some areas in a slightly different way, a non-typical way. If we explore that in terms of giving you confidence of working with neurodivergent people, at the heart of it is memory, information processing, and executive functioning. Those are the differences in neurodivergent brains, and it comes out in different ways. So if you're dyslexic, it's how you process the information around language. If you're dyscalculic, it's how you process the information around numbers that's different. Can you see how these conditions overlap? If you're autistic, it's often how you process information around the sensory world, but also lots of information is sometimes processed and prioritized in a slightly different way. So an autistic brain doesn't necessarily process social information as quickly or as easily, or it might not process some of the communication skills as readily or as easily, but it can really process information that requires detail and focus. And that's where we get our experts and specialists from in terms of being autistic. How memory is processed as well is slightly different in terms of the structure of the brain, and also executive functioning. If you're not as familiar with the term executive functioning, think about a personal assistant sitting in your brain. Think about the PA, the executive sitting in your brain that organizes your day-to-day skills, all the things you need to do. Imagine you're in your beds. Let's do a little journey around executive functioning. You're in your beds, you're relaxed. You've got an hour to get outside your door. I don't mind who's home, which hotel room you're in, I won't ask, but wherever you are, you have to get to the other side of that door and have everything you need for the day. That requires executive functioning. And if you're neurodivergent, sometimes your executive functioning skills aren't as strong, or perhaps working in a slightly different way. So those are the key areas of neurodivergent brains that are operating differently depending on if you have autism, or if you're autistic, or you have ADHD, or if you're dyslexic, etc. Those are the processing differences in the brain. And the brain is connecting slightly differently as well. We don't see this stuff on the outside, we see this stuff on the inside. MRI scans show us this. There's medical evidence through research that shows that neurodivergent brains are processing information and making connections throughout the brain in a slightly different way. How does this come out then? How do these processing differences present themselves? They present themselves in terms of learning preferences. So a person with ADHD may prefer to learn things quickly, may prefer to learn things by doing visually, and not spend long chunks of time really focusing on something they're not particularly interested in. They'll get more excited by things they're interested in. If you're autistic, your learning preference is to know things in depth, to know detail, to know facts. What a brilliant skill for your careers, actually, to really know something inside out, back to front, and all the way around. That would be a learning preference of an autistic person. The responses the person gives might vary slightly because the brain is processing slightly differently. So how a person responds to a situation might be slightly different. It's really fascinating. I've worked with some universities recently, and I found out that the vast majority of one particular university's paramedic trainees had ADHD because the way they responded to situations was perfect for the role of ADHD. That ability to work at energy, to make quick decisions, to make fast decisions, and then switch back off again. And just straight to downtime, and then switch back on speed. So how they responded to situations was very much driven by their ADHD brains, the skills of an ADHD brain. So how they responded to things was driven by the way information's processed in their brains. Social needs might be affected in terms of being neurodivergent, and put aside the TV stereotypes that you might see, put aside the stereotypes you see in the media of what a neurodivergent person might be in terms of socializing. It might be true that an autistic person perhaps doesn't want to socialize with their colleagues as much, or perhaps socialize in different ways, or not prioritize it as much, but it doesn't mean they are deficit in social skills, but the social needs might be slightly different. Emotional regulation can be slightly different if you're neurodivergent as well. So how emotions are processed and dealt with, and how a person responds emotionally might be different. And please note that I'm saying different. I'm not saying weak. I'm not saying deficient. I'm not saying less able. Different processing ways, different ways of learning, different ways of responding, different social needs, different ways perhaps in terms of emotional regulation, and that might impact how a person communicates. Again, if we think of an autistic person who might prefer to trade in facts, deal with information, where preciseness and correctness are really important, that might shape how they prefer to communicate. Doesn't mean they can't communicate in other ways, but that might be their preference. A person with ADHD often has lots of energy when they communicate, can get quite excited about things. So that's a communication preference for them, to sort of almost not let you finish your sentence and hop in with great ideas and great thoughts. That's a communication difference. So by explaining this, I'm hoping to show that neurodivergent differences come from how memory, information processing and executive functioning is operating within the brain, and how the connectivity around the brain is prioritized and information is dealt with. And these are the key things that we often see. And it's different if you're autistic. It's different if you have ADHD. These things come out in different ways. But these where you might see differences, where a person's behavioural responses may seem a little bit unfamiliar or unexpected at first, but they're driven by these processing differences within the brain. Neurodivergent people are everywhere. Now, you might recognise some of the faces on this screen, you may not. All of these people are open and honest about being neurodivergent, and there are many, many more people I could add. So I would say some A-listers and some minor celebrities on there, and a few people from politics and business. Neurodivergent people are everywhere and are succeeding everywhere with the right support, with the right understanding, and making their own adjustments and perhaps getting adjustments where needed in the workplace. Neurodivergent people are, well, we are everywhere, and doing all sorts of marvellous things. So I think in terms of understanding the everydayness of being neurodivergent, we are everywhere. And there are so many people who have yet to be diagnosed, who perhaps diagnosis wasn't available when they were in school, when they were in education. So they're sitting there in their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s and beyond, suddenly thinking, actually, I think this is applying to me. And most of the people on this screen actually were late diagnosed in terms of being neurodivergent. They were not diagnosed in childhood. Reports suggest that around 14% of the UK population is neurodivergent, and co-occurrence of these conditions is common. We're seeing more and more reports of autism and ADHD, to have those side by side, ADHD and dyslexia, or dysgraphia and autism. You can mix and match and as you want. I haven't come across anybody yet who declares to have all six, but there's always a first time for everything. Autism rates are estimated at 1 in 36. That's a figure from the United States, and 1 in 44. It's quite difficult to count the autistic people because not everyone discloses. Some people might get a private diagnosis. Some people have yet to be diagnosed, but we put those figures at around 1 in 36 or 1 in 44 in the UK. The rates are different because of how we diagnose people and how those systems and schemes work, not necessarily because there are different levels of rates in different countries. And some parts of the world are simply not in a position to diagnose people with autism. In September 2024, there were over 200,000 people in England with an open referral for an autism diagnosis. Consider that that is a 25% increase from June 2023. More and more people are becoming aware of their differences and are stepping forward for diagnosis. The average wait time for diagnosis is from 2 years up to 7 years at the moment for both autism and ADHD. Around 4% of the population, it's believed, have ADHD. And we're not all a little bit autistic or have ADHD. A lot of people say that, oh, we're all on the spectrum somewhere, or we're all a little bit this. They are distinct and impactful neurodevelopmental differences. In order to get the diagnosis, you have to show that these conditions are impacting you day to day. Perhaps not in a negative way, but perhaps you're doing things in a different way or a non-typical way. And because these traits are human traits, they seem familiar. So people think, oh, I'm a little bit like that, or I've got a bit of that. You probably have, because these are human traits. They're all things we all recognise and we all do. Being neurodivergent are not alien characteristics, but they're a distinct grouping of characteristics for each diagnosis that gives those differences. And they are invisible disabilities or non-obvious disabilities, and people do not have to disclose their diagnosis. That is up to them. Disclosed information must be protected. And many people don't disclose because they don't want to have to walk into every environment and every room and say, hello, my name is Helen and I am, or I have, and we have to respect that right. But it can be very helpful when people are willing to disclose and share their diagnosis. Perhaps we can understand where some of their differences or challenges are coming from, but also ensure we're putting the right supports in place for them at the right time. The conditions don't impact intelligence directly in any way, but they do affect how people learn and communicate. Again, that's a common myth in terms of understanding people who are neurodivergent. Are they capable of doing the job? Absolutely, but perhaps they might learn or express themselves in slightly non-standard ways, or work harder to express themselves in typical ways as well. If I dive in very loosely into the 4 conditions, so I've kind of touched on these already. It's a lot harder to get diagnosis of one of these things as an adult. There aren't many diagnostic services out there, and it's often done through charities. But children may get diagnosed in school and then will come to you as part of their training. Dyslexia, it is about how the brain decodes words and language. If you think of the word cat, I can see the word cat. I can see a cat, I can link it to the image. I can spell it, read it, write it, say it, I can bounce that word around. If you're dyslexic, your brain doesn't readily process those things as easily. Dysgraphia impacts how things are put on paper. Dyscalculia is around numbers and math skills. And dyspraxia is that varying coordination and movement difficulties. All of those come from the differences in how information is processed, how memory operates, and how executive functioning operates. But goodness, you know, I hate to stereotype, but we've got some really good visual auditory thinkers there. Creative, alternative working styles, fast thinking and problem solving skills often come hand in hand with those conditions. If I touch on autism very briefly, autistic brains, if we think about them in terms of a motorway network and a thought network, autistic brains aren't very good at connecting lots of bits of their brain at once. So if you think of a motorway network with A roads and motorways and B roads and tracks and byways and highways, all bouncing all over the place, the autistic brain doesn't bounce along those as quickly and as readily. They prefer more fixed term routes. It can take a little bit longer to turn off those pathways, but there's lots of short range connectivity, and that leads to hyper-focus specialisms and the strong need for routines and consistencies. So autistic brains can flex and think. It just takes a little bit more effort to shift off those routes, those neural pathways. If you're supporting an autistic pupil, in terms of where you might see differences, strong need around routine, some fixed thoughts, a strong need for consistency, perhaps some differences in social need, because socializing does take more energy and it does take more active thinking. You will see an ability to really hyper focus on something. And you will perhaps see some different communication needs in how that person might express themselves, or might be a little bit quieter at times, or express themselves very directly. But autistic people will benefit from low sensory spaces at times, reduced overwhelm when that's possible, some structure to what they're doing, and support with change. You can come out of those things and work in those environments that don't offer those things, but it's nice to be able to go back into those spaces or areas of structure or support with change when needed. Are autistic people, I might sound biased, I very probably am, clear, concise, relevant, logical, completers, accurate, finished, committed, experts and specialists? What more do you want in your industry? People thinking like that, without a doubt. I am touching on these conditions very lightly. I'm very aware of time, but I really want to kind of give you those headline statements, those kind of overviews when you're working with autistic people to see those differences. But remember, autistic people still have the layers that everyone else has in terms of who they are, where those values come from, those behaviours and beliefs. There's some processing differences, which are responsible for some different behaviours and some real strengths and skills. A person with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. It's not particularly lovely labelling, is it? The deficit, the disorder. But that's a medical diagnosis that's given, so that's the language I'll run with, the medical language. And ADHD is very much a difference in how the brain regulates itself in terms of reward and attention, and that's primarily linked to receiving and processing the hormone dopamine and producing dopamine. ADHD people may have great bursts of energy and excitement, and that might kind of drop, but they might seek activity and engagement and conversation because that excites them. Think about when I mentioned the paramedics, the training, kind of perfect for an ADHD. Some people with ADHD may choose to take medication which can stimulate or calm some areas of the brain. There can be significant side effects of this. It's very much a choice. The effect isn't long lasting, and there is a national shortage of some brands around that. The reason I mention that is you might be working with someone or supporting someone who may or may not choose to take medication, may only be for a while, may not. So you might see a little sort of variation in how they're behaving, or their attention works, or their focus works, as they do or do not take the medication for ADHD. And if we're thinking about an ADHD person, maybe some areas, depending on that person and the other skills and personality they have and the things they've learned and experienced, may need a little bit more support in terms of time management and self-management, because they can hyper-focus for long periods of time and really get excited by and lost in interests and passions. Energy level might come in bursts and might drop. The best thing in the world, the worst thing in the world. Energy might go up or down. You might see signs of them feeling restless or impatient, sometimes maintaining focus on what they view, not what you view, but what they view as a boring task might be a challenge at times. And impulsive or risk-taking, and I want to put varying degrees with a big blaring siren and big exclamation marks and bold, to varying degrees. Not every person with ADHD is going to be jumping out of aeroplanes or wrestling with tigers. For some people, it looks a little bit like, oh, I mustn't, that door says do not enter, I'm tempted beak, or that button says do not push, or I might just push it anyway. No big red buttons, of course, but it might come to that, oh, I just want to, oh, I just can't. So don't overly concern yourself about that impulsiveness and risk taking. Although some of the celebrities that I kind of illustrated over the photos, a lot of them have spoken about actually the impulsive and risk taking nature of ADHD for them have led to some interesting lives, I think, how they would describe it. But our ADHD is strengths, energy, enthusiasm, motivated, commitment, positivity, ideas, creative, engaged, chatty, fun, lively daydreamers. Sometimes that ADHD is going on in the head, the busyness, sometimes it's coming out through the body and what they say. But again, an absolute brilliance to being ADHD, but some areas where they might need a little bit more support. I want to touch very loosely on sensory processing difficulties. Just be aware, if somebody you're supporting talks about sensory needs, these are the areas: vision, hearing, smell, taste, touch, movement, body awareness, and internal sensations, where their sensory system might not work as effectively. And this is common across all people who are neurodivergent. They may have some sensory difficulties about seeking certain input from certain textures or flavours, or some things are overwhelming, or you can tolerate bright lights and noise or certain smells for a short period of time, but you'd like to avoid them where you can. Integrating all those sensories, and sometimes you can get overwhelmed by sensory environments. So do remember, when a neurodivergent person talks about sensory distress, it's important perhaps to respect that, because it can be very overwhelming being pushed into sensory distress, and those are the different areas where we might be impacted in terms of our senses. This is a massive subject that really needs a lot of time to explore, but if I raise it now, at least when somebody talks about their sensory needs, you can have a little insight into how they might be impacted. I want to just, I'm very aware of our time, I want to touch on just if you are supporting someone who's neurodivergent through pupillage, be aware if you feel there is a gap in between what they're currently doing. and what you're expecting of them. It might be because of their general skills, knowledge or attitude. They may have an uneven skill profile, very common if you're neurodivergent, excel at some things, a little bit weaker in other areas. It's very common if you're neurodivergent. They may not have enough feedback in terms of how they're performing. There might be poor communication skills from you, from them, from the people around them. Their neurodivergent needs may not be being met, and that needs a conversation. There may be a lack of adjustments around them. You can't adjust every environment if you're neurodivergent. That's really important to note. You can't adjust every environment, but where you can, you try and make it more comfortable, more survivable, or more accessible. It's about removing those barriers. Those adjustments are there to remove those barriers to success, barriers to learning. Sometimes there might be just a misplaced focus. If you're neurodivergent, you might not be focusing the right thing. So shifting focus onto what's important can help. Many neurodivergent people mask or hide their difficulties. They're not comfortable sharing that there are differences in terms of who they are, what they're doing. And it needs a conversation again, not by asking, do you think you might be autistic, but asking, where can I better support you? What are you finding difficult at the moment? What are barriers to your success? Where can we make some adjustments to enable you to access this, to enable you to succeed in this environment, or you to be pushed a little bit where your environment might be comfortable and have somewhere where your environment's more comfortable you can go back to and kind of resettle. Because if we're thinking about reasonable adjustments, this is the final thing I want to talk about. The duty for reasonable adjustments come to under the Equality Act 2010. Now, I hand that over to you, the Equality Act 2010, as you are the legal experts, and I am not, but I do know the Equality Act. That is one to look at in detail if you are not sure about. But if somebody makes a request for reasonable adjustment, you must respond to that request, particularly if they're using that language. Your approach should be consistent. And if you are saying yes and you are saying no, that should be a defendable decision. Why have you said no? Why have you said yes? And to some degree, they should be preemptive. If you know somebody has a condition, such as dyslexia, have those conversations beforehand. So on their first day working with you, those adjustments are in place. If they need tweaking, changing, adapting, removing, that's fine, that's the process. But there is a duty to provide reasonable adjustments under the Equality Act and the protected characteristic of disability. Sometimes when you're looking at people who are neurodivergent and some of the barriers, you might review policy and processes across your area, across the work that you're doing, and that provides improvements for all. And very often people review and change how things are done. There might be times where you just make an accommodation in the moment. Could I do this piece of work remotely? Could I have a quieter space in the office? Could I book out a room just to focus on this? For this time, can I just wear my ear defenders? Can I just change the lighting where I'm sitting, thinking about their sensory needs? There might be just accommodations you can make in the moment that are responsive, that are helping people to succeed in the environments that they are in. This will be given to you, this is available as recording. There's loads of ideas here. And I hate to say Google or whatever browser you prefer. Google, search for those reasonable adjustments. There are so many out there. Not everything applies to everyone, but do spot possible problem areas and work together on them. Don't assume that thinking is common. Explore where the difficulties are. Support that person's output, not necessarily where they're doing it. Where there's flexibility about inputs, where they do it, allow those. Clarify any unwritten rules or social expectations. Focus on what can be done with that person. And if they have any I can'ts because they're anxious or unsure, turn those into chunks of I can, doable tasks, and look out for those signs of overwhelm. Neurodivergent people are capable and competent, but are expected to work in neurotypical environments that don't accommodate, understand, or appreciate their needs or their differences. And that's where overwhelm comes from. Unrealistic expectations that are very, I use the word ableist, very restricted to people who have a disability or who might work in a different way, and that's what leads to the overwhelm. So those are the ideas on the far side of that screen, but there are lots of different things that you can tackle. And if your pupil isn't sure of what to do, work together to come up with those solutions and come up with those ideas to support them. This is a huge topic. I have whizzed through this to give you an idea, to give you some insight, and I really hope that's been useful. Anything you want to double check and clarify, please do come back to me. But I'm eating into our time as I group. I spend too long talking about this because I get excited and enthusiastic, so I apologise for that. But I will stop at this point now and hope that has made sense for you.
Speaking for myself, that has been incredibly useful, Helen.
Super.
Okay, I am going to turn immediately to the questions. We are proposing to go through the questions sort of in order of progression through the bar. So starting with questions that are particularly relevant to prospective pupils in relation to interviews and disclosure, though also relevant to applications to tenancy from pupillage, and to interviews you might have later in your career, whether moving chambers or for judicial posts or silk. As I mentioned in introduction, the question of disclosure, when to do it and how much is huge. And I would like to start by asking the panel what views they've got about that. But just to read one of the questions that have been posted, I am double neurodivergent, but also have other hidden disabilities and some visible. We need RAs to address the whole person, not just one condition. I've been advised not to diagnose my neurodiversity in pupillage applications for the paper sift at least, but this seems disingenuous. Do you agree? Others have asked whether neurodivergent applicants are disadvantaged by EDI data not being included, if it means that the panel are working without knowledge of a person's neurodiversity. Who would like to kick off? Oliver.
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to kick off. So taking them step by step then, in terms of whether or not someone should disclose when they're making an application, and whether or not the removal of it is the removal of disclosure from the application itself into a sort of separate pile, literally physically a separate pile often, of E&D info. It's an entirely personal question, it's an entirely personal issue. I think no one who thinks about it carefully is going to tell you definitively whether or not you should or shouldn't disclose. And I think anyone who's told you specifically not to disclose hasn't thought about it carefully, with the greatest respect to them. I think if you feel that it is important to show who you are as a candidate as a whole, especially if it is relevant to, for example, if you're a late diagnosed neurodivergent person and it would have affected the way you were examined and you would have been given reasonable adjustments and examinations that you weren't given, it can absolutely be relevant to your application as a whole and important context to your, I don't know, A-level grades or university grades or the like. I don't think it disadvantages someone for that to be disclosed and for that disclosure to be removed from the application itself, because if you think it's important part of the paper sift marking, include it in the mitigating circumstances. I think the reason for the equality and diversity form being removed from the application itself is so that someone's protected characteristics don't negatively or positively colour the marking. And I think that's important, and I don't think we should be critical of that. I think that's valid, but I don't think this potential negative of it meaning we failed to take account of someone's neurodivergence that was undiagnosed when they were younger, is a reason to include that form in its entirety. That's a reason to include your neurodivergence in the mitigating circumstances box. In terms of whether or not you're advantaged or disadvantaged in applying, the reality is that the bar is a plethora of progressiveness and non-progressiveness. And in some chambers, you might be disadvantaged because you're being marked by people who I would describe as bigots, but who might not necessarily be described as that by everyone. But also the reality is that the vast majority of the people answering or running through the paper sifts and marking these forms are people of my level of call. I mean, maybe even Alice is too senior now to be forced into doing this marking at this point. It really is the most junior end of the bar who are, generally speaking, the most progressive and who aren't going to count it against you, even if they would want to, because they aren't able to. And if you give them a reason to give you the benefit of the doubt for certain things that might not meet the grade, quite literally, they probably will give you that benefit of the doubt, and you're more likely to get interviews, in my opinion, if you disclose relevant characteristics that have affected your grades. I would advocate for the fact that it is a very personal decision, but on balance, I think you should disclose it. But if you don't want to because it makes you uncomfortable, or because you, for whatever reason, just decide you don't want to share that information, fair enough, then don't. But I don't think there's a hard and fast rule. Sorry, rambling.
No, thanks very much, Oliver. Alice.
So sharing a diagnosis or a condition that you have, especially in a professional environment like the bar, can feel really vulnerable. And for a lot of neurodivergent people, you might be afraid of being misunderstood or judged or categorized or seen as less capable. I know that there are moments when I think about my own neurodivergence and think that it might overshadow my abilities or success, or make me be seen in a different light to what I would like. But I have learned that sharing about my diagnosis, when approached really on my terms, can open the doors to better support and collaboration and events like this tonight. And from my perspective, the key thing is to foster a safe and non-judgmental environment where disclosure or sharing feels like an invitation, not an obligation. The difficulty is we're not there yet. We're still having seminars, which is amazing, to teach people about what autism means, what ADHD is, what dyslexia is. And I know that it can be difficult for people even who are of one category of neurodivergency to understand others. And so we're still in a cultural sense, still at a very much a learning and understanding stage with neurodiversity as a whole. And everyone I have come across who is neurodivergent or even uses that word would describe themselves really differently and have a very personal view about whether or not they want to talk about their diagnosis or not, or whether or not they want to share it. From my perspective, I see it quite similarly to whether or not you want to talk about your sexuality as well. I think it's got some similarities, and in other ways I think it's quite different, because with sharing your if you're autistic, if you're sharing your diagnosis, or you're sharing your special educational need or whatever it is, however you want to just characterize it, it opens the doors to getting help and support. And it doesn't mean that you have to say to everyone all the time repeatedly that you are X and therefore you need Y. But I have found that sharing with my clerks, with a slim pool, and talking to people, obviously I'm quite public about it because of my wider work, but other people might find it's quite useful, I would say, to open up to your supervisor about it. I say that's really important, actually. But to then focus on being able to get that support. And I thought, Helen, the slide that you had with a number of different reasonable adjustments that could be applied for so many different conditions was really valuable, because I think that one of the difficulties that many young people joining the bar might have, or older people joining the bar might have, is not knowing what to ask for. And they know they need some help, but not knowing necessarily what to ask for. So the more that people talk about it, the more people share. Actually, I found this really helpful. I found it really helpful, for example, to say to the clerks, please don't call me, just put everything in writing. My personal approach. And so, saying that, I mean, that barrister was able to ask for that. Okay, I can ask for something similar, and it's okay. So I do think it's It's an incredibly personal choice. But I agree with Ollie that if you have been told you mustn't tell anyone, that is cultivating an environment that we don't want at the bar. And if you are worried that that particular chambers won't accept you for who you are and for all of the strengths and wonderful characteristics that you will also have as a consequence of being neurodivergent, that might not be the right chambers for you. And you need to be somewhere where you can be celebrated and become an excellent barrister as well. So those are my thoughts.
Thanks, Alice. Helen?
I think there is advantages and disadvantages to disclosing your diagnosis, and I think as Alice and Oliver has said, you don't want to have to show everything all the time. I think if something isn't working or you need to explain something, perhaps the difference of the situation, then it can be useful. But it's also worth noting, and Alice has touched it a little bit, not everybody's an expert in their condition as well. This is an area of developing science. It's very difficult to access this information. This is why I do the work I do. And having these conversations are important. How might you, if as chambers you say we support applications from neurodivergent candidates, this is what we offer, this is where we've supported the people, the case studies are out there, people are talking about this stuff. It makes people more confident to have those conversations, more confident to have the needs, and then everybody gets educated at the same time. Because that's saying you're not all experts on this, and say individuals aren't necessarily. People are often just given a diagnosis, a letter, a phone call, a voicemail saying, oh, by the way, you have ADHD, off you go, bye. So they come to you sometimes not knowing much about it themselves, so they're unwilling to disclose because perhaps they can't express what they need, or they're still finding out themselves. So I think where we can take leadership, gain the understanding and have open conversations, more people will be willing to disclose when they feel it necessary or when they choose. They should never be forced to disclose, and they should never be afraid to disclose, because it's your thing that you own and should be proud of, but that can present challenges sometimes that you might need support with, or to be able to explain certain behaviours or certain perhaps slight differences that the people are not quite getting at the moment. So it is that person's thing that we should support them with, but not force them in either direction about disclosing or not.
Thanks very much. Our work, both within my own chambers at Doughty Street and on the disability panel, has emphasised that this is an overwhelming issue for many pupils. And as the questioner whose question that I read out demonstrates, it will often not even be as simple as do you disclose a neurodivergent condition, because you may have a range of disabilities, seen and unseen, and neurodivergences, and you may want to disclose some for some purposes and others for other purposes. And one of the things that Chambers needs to understand is the huge concern that pupils and applicants for anything have about disclosure, and they may disclose slowly because they feel that they are disclosing on a need-to-know basis, and chambers and supervisors shouldn't be surprised and certainly shouldn't be critical if disclosure is made on a incremental basis of different conditions, or the extent of a condition, or the extent of the challenges to which they face as a result of any condition. We are challenged for time. I'm allowed to go a few minutes, but only a few minutes over. I've had an interesting question about interviews. This applies obviously to applicants for pupillage, but again, obviously to applicants for tenancy. And it's what sort of RAs can you ask for? And in particular, are you entitled to ask for advance notice of questions? And someone has helpfully shared with us guidance from the civil service indicating that it will be a reasonable adjustment often to ask for questions in advance. And this is something that the Bar Council knows from the feedback it gets from chambers. Unfortunately, is something that chambers struggle to understand, and it's something that the Bar Council is going to look at further and consult further on with a view to developing our understanding and guidance. But is there anything else that anyone would like to say? And I'm sorry, it'll have to be very brief, just specifically about reasonable adjustments for interviews.
Yes, of course. So from a Equality Act perspective, the chambers, I don't know, somebody's had some advice in the chat that says that they shouldn't be asking for reasonable adjustments. That's not right. I'm disappointed that you've received that advice, and that it's important that we do provide, and Neurodiversity and all the charity that I'm working with as a trustee, we're going to produce some more guidance on this. So it's really important, as Helen has said, for you to know what to ask for, and for people to be, and for chambers also to be proactive about things, so that the person asking doesn't feel completely burdened to ask. So having a list of things, so if you need X, ask for this. If you need it in a bigger font, ask for this. If you need it in a different format, you know, thinking about ways as a chambers that you can anticipate those reasonable adjustments in advance, as is your legal duty to do so for applicants, and to then also give an arm ordinary applicants with the knowledge that they need to ask for those adjustments, and to then be able to approach them as a chambers reasonably and get advice if needed.
I think the word reasonable is key there. There's no definitive guidance. Perhaps this answers quite a few questions at once, as it has to be reasonable. Are you placing someone at a significant disadvantage by not allowing an adjustment, but is it still reasonable? In terms of law, there are no set answers, so you have to consider each scenario and each situation, sometimes as individual cases. But is it reasonable, and can I defend this decision or can I not? And a very good question about people who are yet to be diagnosed, people who self-identify. Some organisations work with the notion of a working diagnosis. There is no formal diagnosis. That person is showing lots of autistic traits or lots of ADHD traits, and some places are working with the right, you're waiting for a diagnosis, or you recognise that you are autistic, or you identify as being autistic or having ADHD, and you can view that as a working diagnosis. Has to be degree of caution there, because it doesn't suddenly become a get out of jail free card because somebody feels today they may have ADHD. This has to be a lot of thought behind thinking that you are autistic or have ADHD, and etc, etc. But there are some cases, precedent has been set where a working diagnosis of being autistic or having ADHD has been used in an organisation rather than a formal diagnosis. But you can imagine that's a very grey and developing area within law, not having a fixed diagnosis and working with a working diagnosis concept. But reasonable adjustments should be reasonable. You have to consider them very carefully about the disadvantage, but also how you can remove those barriers, enable somebody to access what everybody else can access as well.
Okay, thanks very much. I'm going to go on to pupillage itself and look at this from the point of view of chambers and pupil supervisors, how they can support and make appropriate adjustments for neurodivergent pupils, including pupils who have not disclosed anything about neurodiversity yet, but who the supervisor perhaps has reason to believe may be facing challenges as a result of being neurodivergent. Who wants to kick off on that?
I'm pleased to see that number of pupil supervisors who are here actually, and will be able to access this talk after this. So I mean, coming to the first part, like learning about these different conditions in the first place to then see, but ultimately it's about spotting when a pupil is overwhelmed and asking in advance of starting, if you can, about the sorts of things that will help that pupil to not become overwhelmed. And that tends to capture quite a lot of things, including mental health difficulties and also disabilities more broadly. And so being proactive rather than waiting for the people to come to you, I think is incredibly important. And also coming to them with, oh, well, another pupil who was here a couple of years ago, they asked for this and this, that was fine. We did this, I have this approach, like being really transparent about the sorts of things that chambers can do. But I would say, if I've ever trained as being a pupil supervisor, which I'm being asked to do at the moment, I would focus on, are there any things that we need to know about that make you feel overwhelmed, and what could we do to support that? And these are the things that we currently do in chambers, and are those things that you'd like to trial?
Thanks very much. Oliver?
I broadly echo what Alice just said. I think if you're the supervisor, or if you're the equality and diversity officer, or in some way in a relatively senior position within chambers, such that pupils might come to you, or that they might not feel they're able to come to you, but they are reliant on you looking after them to some degree, just in a private, comfortable and informal setting, opening the conversation and just starting the ball rolling, and being entirely honest perhaps with your position, that you aren't fully up to speed and you don't know all the answers, but that you're there to make sure they get the most out of pupils they can, and that you're there to help them get through it as best you can. That's really all that anyone can ask of you. I think the two main concerns that people who are neurodivergent have, I say that as as someone who's neurodivergent and who went through pupillage surprisingly long time ago now, but 6 years ago or so, fear of not knowing how it's going to be received if you bring it up at all is a big factor, and a reason that some people don't bring it up at all. And so if you, as the supervisor, start the ball rolling and show that you're open to that conversation, that will mitigate or possibly even entirely eliminate that initial barrier. And then after that, no one needs to pretend to know to have all the answers. As we've heard from Helen, a fantastic point she made is that people aren't experts in their own issues, their own neurodivergences. So have the conversation. It may be that someone knows someone to ask. My former supervisor rang me in the not too distant past because my old chambers had a neurodivergent pupil, to chat about what was going on. These organisations like Neurodiversity in Law and the Bar Council Disability Panel exist to answer these questions, and we're here to help as best as we can as well. But just showing openness, starting the conversation, I think is the best way to begin.
Helen?
I think the points raised about not being fearful, but I am Helen. Being neurodivergent is part of that. It's not everything. So I think it's about tackling each challenge or each difference as it comes, not assuming anything about a neurodivergent person, as I said, just because you've met one autistic person, but you might have met an autistic person with that background or this background or those beliefs and those sorts, so that they're different every time. I think it is just about being open and comfortable, not assuming everything is down to them being neurodivergent, not assuming they are just autistic or just ADHD. I am a whole, I am Helen. The bit of my brain is processing differently. But I think when there's a difference, when there's something you're not understanding, or when there's a communication challenge or behaviour you're not sure about, or where there's feedback to be given, then you factor perhaps the condition into it. But at the end of the day, I'm just Helen, trying to do my best job in the best way and fit into the world. So being neurodivergent is just a part of that. So tackle that with confidence when you need to, but only really when it presents a challenge. I get on with things in my own weird and wonderful way and have successes in all sorts of places. Being neurodivergent is just a part of that. It's not everything. But if there's anything to question, it's just to be comfortable and get the advice, as Olive said. Ask people, as Oliver said, ask people who know. There's advice out there, there's information, there's an internet to search, there's so much advice out there to access it, but don't be fearful, I think. And remember, that person is still a whole. They are not just ADHD, they are not just dyslexia.
Thanks very much. We've just got time for one quick round on the reasonable adjustments that people may need after pupillage when they are actually practicing at the bar. A couple of things that have been raised in the questions include how to raise with a judge, perhaps the night before a hearing, that you've got reasonable adjustments that mean that you cannot deal with getting questions or tasks without sufficient notice. And secondly, where chambers expect you to be engaged in sort of marketing and working on developing professional relationships, which may pose challenges for people with neurodivergent conditions, how best to approach these. Again, I'll go in the same order: Alice, Oliver, and then Helen.
So we've got a leaflet on this, if it's helpful. So we published it on our website. So that's my short answer to that question, Mark, if that's helpful. Yeah, and given the time, I'll pause there. But we've got materials on that we're developing. They're online, that we always would like some more information to add to. So I'll probably update it after this evening.
No, that's really helpful. Thank you, Alice. Oliver.
In terms of the judges have a lot of training, but they don't necessarily all adhere precisely to what they ought to be doing. But if you make sure you term and phrase whatever request you're making in the interests of their client, your client, sorry, and whoever's hearing or trial or overseeing, fairness to that client, then that will certainly be the most persuasive, in my opinion, way to frame any requests. So if you say, I need time to read this so that this hearing can be done justly, if you have a judge who says no to that, then you've got perhaps an appealable point, but certainly it's going to be something that pressures the judge correctly. In terms of marketing, I don't think any chambers can actually say you must attend these events. I mean, realistically, that's just not going to. I mean, they might really pressure you, and maybe I'm just blissfully unaware because I'm in quite a nice chambers. I'm happy to be corrected, but you are ultimately your own self-employed person. In terms of doing marketing and developing your practice, I think every barrister does need to do something and some things to develop their practice and market themselves. If you have reticence, for whatever reason, don't want to attend certain types of events, I would just talk to the clerks and the practice managers about that. And if possible, people hate being given problems, but they love being given solutions. So if you have alternatives that you could say, this kind of event in this, for me, very loud, echoey environment late in the evening with lots of people drinking, I find really difficult to process and to be in any way good company. But if we did this other kind of event where I could speak to people maybe outside or maybe in an environment that isn't so echoey or whatever along those lines, if you come with the solutions and the alternatives, then that might help steer things in that direction. And it's more likely to attract solicitors who also prefer those kinds of events, who you can then make a connection with almost potentially on that basis as well.
Yeah. Thanks.
Sorry, I'll end there. Thanks.
Helen, in a minute, if you can.
I was going to say there's some brilliant questions, and I'm getting a little message saying we are very much out of time. So I think we're going to try and endeavour to answer some of these questions and publish the answers where we can. So rather than me rattle on, it might be best popping these into written form and realising we're out of time. Apologies for speaking for too long.
Sure, no, not at all. And thanks very much. Yeah, these questions highlight what I said earlier, both from clerks, from established practitioners, and particularly from judges. There is a tendency to think that a barrister must have the attributes that they had. So, for example, that a judge had at the bar when he, as it usually will be, was able to take a brief the night before or work till midnight or handle questions being thrown at them. So it's an education exercise. Thank you very much to everyone and to all the attendees. I'm sorry we've gone just over 10 minutes over, but it was incredibly interesting, certainly for me. We will be sending round an email to all attendees in which we will include links, and we will also endeavour to produce further answers to questions to be circulated to attendees. But thank you very much to our panel and to Angela at the Bar Council for making sure that this all goes operationally all right, and especially to you all for attending and for your incredibly thought-provoking questions. Thanks very much and have a great evening.